The paper shook in Charlotte Wilcox's hand, not because the desert wind had found its way through the cracked window of the Sweetwater saloon, but because the man sitting across from her had just said something that cracked her world clean in two. "Your husband finished nothing," Phineas Ashford said, his voice low and controlled, the kind of voice that had learned to hold storms inside it. "You, Mrs. Wilcox, finished every last piece of it, and I suspect you always knew that." Charlotte set the deed on the warped oak table between them. Her black mourning dress was dusty from 3 days of hard travel, and there were calluses on her palms that no lady's gloves could entirely conceal. She had rehearsed this moment for 6 weeks, every mile of the journey from Kansas City to the New Mexico territory, and still nothing had prepared her for the way Phineas Ashford looked at her. Not with suspicion, not with grief, and not with the cold appraisal of a business rival. He looked at her as though he already knew every secret she had carried across those desert miles, and worse, as though he had been waiting. "That is a dangerous thing to say to a widow," she told him. "I've said dangerous things to dangerous women before," he replied. "It doesn't trouble me the way it used to." She pulled the deed back across the table, tucking it into the leather satchel she had not let out of her sight since she left the train in Las Cruces. Inside that satchel was everything. The deed to the Copper Bell Ranch, 3 letters written in her dead husband's hand, a promissory note worth $12,000 that her husband, Gerald Wilcox, had borrowed from Phineas Ashford 8 months before a rattlesnake bite, and a fever had stolen him from the world. And a 4th letter, written in a different hand entirely, one that had told her to come to Sweetwater, to find the man called Ashford, and to tell him that the debt had already been paid. The trouble was, Charlotte had not paid it. Not yet. Not in any way she could prove. And Phineas Ashford was looking at her like she had. She had not come to Sweetwater looking for love. She had come looking for a way to keep the ranch that her husband had mortgaged to a man she had never met, to save the only solid thing that remained of a marriage that had been more complicated than the polite version she gave to neighbors and ministers. She had come because Gerald had made a mess of things, the way Gerald had always made a mess of things, and because there was no one left to clean it up but her. What she had not anticipated was Phineas Ashford himself. 6 weeks earlier, Charlotte had been standing in the kitchen of the Copper Bell Ranch outside Las Cruces, New Mexico, reading a letter from a law office in Santa Fe. The letter was direct and businesslike. It informed her that the promissory note her late husband had signed with one Phineas Ashford of Sweetwater, New Mexico, would come due on the 1st of October, 1882, and that in the event of default, the Copper Bell Ranch and all its holdings, including the water rights on the Southern Creek, would transfer to Mr. Ashford's possession within 30 days of that date. The 1st of October was 42 days away when that letter arrived. Charlotte had stood in the kitchen for a long time, reading the letter twice more. Then she had folded it with the precise, unhurried movements of a woman who had learned that panic was a luxury she could not afford, and she had gone to the desk in Gerald's study. Gerald's desk was chaos. Gerald had always been chaos. He had been charming in the way of men who do not entirely mean harm but cannot help causing it, and he had loved Charlotte in the way such men love things, with tremendous enthusiasm and very poor follow-through. He had borrowed money to expand the ranch without telling her. He had signed over the water rights as collateral without telling her. He had died without a will, without a plan, and without leaving anything resembling a clear account of what he owed and to whom. The law office letter was not the first Charlotte had received from creditors. It was, however, the largest single debt, and the one with the most immediate consequence. She had spent 2 days sorting the desk. In the bottom drawer, beneath a rolled survey map and a broken compass, she found Gerald's correspondence with Phineas Ashford. 5 letters in Gerald's handwriting, spanning 8 months. 3 letters back from Ashford, written in a clean, deliberate script that suggested a man who chose his words carefully. Charlotte read all of them. The story they told was not the one she had expected. Gerald had not gone to Phineas Ashford for a simple loan. He had gone to him because Ashford had bought the mineral rights to a piece of land that lay adjacent to the Copper Bell, a section of rocky high ground that Gerald had always insisted was worthless. The letters showed a negotiation, a partnership proposal of sorts, and then a complication. Gerald had believed there was copper in that high ground, not enough to make anyone rich on its own, but enough, combined with the water access from the southern creek, to make the whole valley worth considerably more than it appeared on paper. He had borrowed from Ashford to fund a survey. The survey had been incomplete when Gerald died. The third letter from Ashford, written 6 weeks before Gerald's death, was the one that made Charlotte sit very still at the desk for a long time. In it, Ashford had written that he had received the partial survey results, and that while the findings were promising, he could not in good conscience hold the note against the ranch if the survey remained unfinished, and the value of the venture was therefore undetermined. He had proposed an extension. He had suggested that if Gerald found himself unable to complete the work due to his illness, Ashford would be willing to discuss alternatives. Gerald had not responded to that letter. Gerald had died 10 days after it arrived, and then Charlotte had found the fourth letter. It was not from the law office. It was not from Gerald. It was from a man named Thomas Rourke, who described himself as a surveyor and occasional associate of Phineas Ashford's, and it was addressed not to Gerald but to Charlotte directly. It had been tucked into the survey map without a note of explanation, and Charlotte's name on the envelope was written in the same careful script as Ashford's letters, as though Ashford himself had left it for her to find. The letter from Thomas Rourke stated that he had completed the survey of the high ground section at Phineas Ashford's private expense following Charlotte Wilcox's death, and that the survey confirmed copper deposits sufficient to make the mineral rights valuable independent of the ranch's water access. It further stated that in Rourke's professional opinion, the arrangement originally discussed between the two men had reached a natural conclusion, and that the terms of the promissory note ought to be revisited in light of the completed survey. At the bottom, in Ashford's handwriting, were 4 words, "Come and find me." Charlotte had read those 4 words 9 times. Then she had begun to pack. She told herself the entire journey that she was going to Sweetwater as a matter of business. She was going to negotiate. She had the deed, she had the letters, and she had the completed survey results that Ashford himself had apparently paid for, which suggested that whatever his original intentions had been, he was not simply a predatory creditor waiting to absorb her husband's land. She was going to present the facts clearly and professionally, the way her father had taught her to present facts in the law office where she had worked as a young woman before Gerald had swept her west with his bright promises and his insufferable optimism. She was not going to be emotional about it. She was going to be competent and precise and entirely businesslike. She had been in Sweetwater for approximately 40 minutes before that plan became complicated. The town itself was what the New Mexico Territory produced in 1882 with some ambition and a reliable water source. It had a main street of baked adobe and rough timber, a hotel with 8 rooms and a dining room that smelled of chili and coffee, a general store, a land office, a telegraph office, a livery stable, and the Sweetwater Saloon, which was the largest building on the street and clearly the social center of the town. There was also a schoolhouse painted a cheerful yellow that seemed almost defiant against the pale dust of everything surrounding it. Charlotte had arrived on the afternoon stage, checked into the hotel, washed the travel from her face, and asked the hotel proprietress where she might find Phineas Ashford. The proprietress, a stout and good-humored woman named Mrs. Elena Vega, had given Charlotte a measuring look before answering. "You are the widow from Las Cruces," she said. It was not a question. "I am," Charlotte said. "Phineas is at the saloon," Mrs. Vega said. "He usually is this time of day. Not drinking," she added quickly, with the tone of a woman who wanted to be fair. "He owns the place. He keeps the accounts there, But if you are going to have a conversation with him about serious business, you should wait until he comes to dinner. He eats here most evenings." Charlotte had considered that advice for about 15 seconds. "Thank you, Mrs. Vega," she said. "I think I will go now." She had walked into the Sweetwater saloon at 4:30 in the afternoon with her leather satchel over her arm, and the full knowledge that every man in the room was looking at her, which was expected, and that one man in the back was not looking at her at all, which was not. Phineas Ashford was sitting at a corner table with a ledger book and a glass of water, writing in the same careful script she recognized from the letters. He was younger than she had imagined him, somewhere in his middle 30s, with dark hair showing the first touch of silver at the temples, and the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and some private difficulty into something more interesting than merely handsome. He wore a good quality shirt, slightly dusty, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had the hands of a man who did not shy from physical work despite the ledger and the business correspondence. He looked up when she stopped at his table. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that reminded Charlotte absurdly of the sky over the desert just before a storm, and they registered her arrival with a calm that felt less like indifference and more like a man who had been expecting something and was quietly unsurprised to see it arrive. "Mrs. Wilcox," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she replied. He had closed the ledger and gestured to the chair across from him, and she had sat down, and they had been in the middle of the most important conversation of her life for approximately 8 minutes before he had said the thing that cracked her world open. "Your husband finished nothing. You finished every last piece of it. And I suspect you always knew that." Now Charlotte sat with her satchel in her lap and the deed returned to it, looking at Phineas Ashford across the scratched table, and she tried to determine whether she was angry or something more complicated. "What exactly," she said carefully, "do you mean by that?" He leaned back in his chair in a way that was not casual, not exactly. It was the posture of a man who was being deliberate about appearing unhurried. "Your husband proposed a partnership. He borrowed money against his land and used it to survey ground that he hoped would make us both wealthy. He died before the picture was complete." He paused. "I completed the picture at my own expense with my own surveyor on my own time, because the debt was not the point." "What was the point?" Charlotte asked. "The point," Phineas said, "was that Gerald Wilcox was right about the copper and right about the water access, and right that together those things made something valuable. He was also profoundly right about something he never put in any of his letters to me." Charlotte waited. "He told me once when we met in person in Santa Fe that his wife was the smartest person he had ever known, and that whatever happened with the venture, if he was ever unable to see it through, she would." Phineas's voice did not change inflection when he said this. He said it the way a man states a fact that he has already verified. "He was talking about you. He was also, as it turned out, completely correct." The silence in the saloon had a particular quality. Around them, the normal life of the place continued, 2 men playing cards near the door, a bartender polishing glasses, a ceiling fan moving the dry hot air in slow circles. But at the corner table, everything was very still. Charlotte said, "Gerald told you that. In Santa Fe, 8 months ago. Shortly before he became too ill to travel." She looked at the satchel in her lap. Gerald, for all his chaos, for all the ways his optimism had skipped over the hard details and landed them in difficulty, had believed in her so completely that he had apparently mentioned it to the man he was doing business with as a matter of practical planning. He had, in his chaotic, well-meaning way, arranged for someone to be waiting for her. She was not going to cry in the Sweetwater saloon. She was absolutely not going to do that. "The debt," she said. "The note." "Forgiven," Phineas said. "In exchange for the partnership terms Gerald originally proposed, with you substituted as the partner, if you are willing." Charlotte looked up from the satchel. "You are forgiving $12,000. I am proposing a business arrangement that makes that number irrelevant," he said. "The copper deposit, with the water access secured through a formal agreement rather than a debt instrument, represents a potential return several times that value over the next 5 years. I am not being charitable, Mrs. Wilcox. I am being practical. She studied his face. There was no performance in it, no salesmanship, no of the bright surface quality that Gerald had always worn when he was about to say something optimistic that would later require cleaning up. Phineas Ashford looked like a man who had done the arithmetic and was presenting the results. "I need to read the survey results myself," she said. "Of course," he said, "and I need to consult with an attorney before signing anything." "There is a good one in Las Cruces," he said. "Ramon Gutierrez. He handled the original mineral rights purchase for me. He is thorough and fair." "I know Ramon Gutierrez," Charlotte said, because she did. He had helped her with the probate paperwork after Gerald died. This felt, suddenly, like the landscape of her life rearranging itself around a pattern she had not noticed until this moment. Phineas reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document, which he set on the table and slid toward her with the same unhurried deliberateness. "The survey results," he said. "Take them back to the hotel. Take as long as you need." She picked up the document but did not stand. Something made her stay seated, something beyond the practical necessity of the conversation. She was trying to understand Phineas Ashford, and she had the feeling that he was a man who would require more than one afternoon to understand. "Why did you pay for the survey yourself?" she asked. "After Gerald died. There was no obligation. The debt was on paper and the land was collateral. You could have called the note and taken the ranch." He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a man searching for an answer, but the quiet of a man deciding whether this was the moment to give the true one. "Because Gerald Wilcox came to me as a man with an honest idea and not enough money," he finally said. "That happens frequently in this territory. Usually I call the note, take the land, and move on. Gerald was different. He had worked out something real, and he talked about you." Charlotte felt the edge of something in that last sentence, something that went slightly sideways from pure business logic, and she filed it away for later consideration. "I will read the survey tonight," she said. "May I find you here tomorrow?" "Every afternoon," he said. "Or at the land office in the morning if you prefer. I keep accounts there as well." She stood and he stood because he was apparently the kind of man who stood when a woman stood, which in Charlotte's experience was not universal. She held out her hand, and he shook it, and she was aware of the warmth of his hand and the steadiness of it, and she was aware that she was aware of it, which was its own kind of information. She walked back through the saloon and out onto the main street of Sweetwater, New Mexico, into the low golden light of late afternoon, and she stood for a moment with the survey documents in one hand and Gerald's satchel in the other, and she thought about the 4 words at the bottom of Ashford's letter. "Come and find me." She had found him. She was not entirely sure what to do with what she had found. That evening, Charlotte ate dinner in Mrs. Vega's dining room and read the survey results twice through. They were written in Thomas Rourke's professional hand and were precise and detailed, and required her to reference the geological terms twice against a dictionary she borrowed from the hotel's small shelf of books. By the end of the second reading, she understood what the survey confirmed. The high ground section that Gerald had believed in contained copper deposits that were not spectacular by the standards of Arizona's great mines, but that were consistent and accessible, and combined with the water rights from the Southern Creek for the milling and processing of ore, made the venture economically serious. Rourke estimated a productive lifespan of 8 to 12 years under reasonable extraction methods, with gross yield figures that made Charlotte set the papers down and look out the window at the dark street for a long moment. If the numbers were accurate, the debt was not $12,000 that needed forgiving. The debt was a very small piece of a much larger picture. She picked up the survey again and read the final page, which contained Rourke's personal assessment and recommendations. At the very end, in a note that was clearly added after the main body of the survey, Rourke had written, "Mr. Ashford has reviewed these findings and directs me to say that his position remains as stated in his previous correspondence. The value of the venture does not change the nature of the original agreement. The ranch stays with its rightful owner. The partnership terms, if accepted, benefit both parties equally. Charlotte folded the survey very carefully and placed it back in the satchel. Gerald had stumbled into something real. Phineas Ashford had recognized it and protected it and waited for her to arrive. She was still not going to let herself feel anything about that tonight. She was going to sleep on it because that was what sensible women did. She did not sleep particularly well. In the morning, she walked to the land office at 8 o'clock and found Phineas Ashford at a desk covered in maps and legal documents, drinking coffee from a tin cup and arguing in a perfectly civil tone with a shorter man whom Charlotte recognized as a land surveyor by the instruments hanging from his belt. Phineas looked up when she came in and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Wilcox," and the surveyor looked at her with the particular alert curiosity of a man who has heard the name recently. "Good morning," Charlotte said. "I have questions." "I expected you would," Phineas said. He said something brief to the surveyor, who nodded and moved to the other end of the office to occupy himself with a large map on the wall, and then Phineas poured a second cup of coffee from a pot on the small iron stove in the corner and set it on the desk nearest Charlotte. "Sit down, please." She sat. She placed the survey document on the desk and opened it to the final page. "The yield estimates," she said. "Rourke calculated these based on comparable operations in Arizona. But our altitude is different and our access to water is different. Have you had a second opinion on these numbers?" He looked at the page she indicated. "Not a formal second opinion," he said. "But I spent 3 weeks in Silver City 2 years ago and I have a reasonable basis for comparison. Rourke tends to be conservative. I think the numbers are likely low." "The machinery required," Charlotte said, "for extraction and initial processing. Rourke specifies a stamp mill. Where would that be sourced, and what is the realistic lead time for installation in this location?" He raised an eyebrow, not in the condescending way she had sometimes encountered from men who were surprised when a woman asked a technical question, but in the way of someone encountering a competency he had anticipated but still found satisfying to confirm. "St. Louis," he said. "By rail to El Paso, then by wagon. 6 to 8 months for the equipment, 3 to 4 months for installation and site preparation. You are looking at operational commencement in approximately 18 months from the date of a signed agreement." "That is a long float period," Charlotte said. "It is," he agreed. "The ranch operations would need to sustain themselves independently during that period without drawing against the venture capital. The cattle on the Copper Bell are healthy and the water situation is stable," Charlotte said. "The ranch can sustain itself. But I need to keep the Southern Creek water rights out of any agreement that would complicate the ranch's independent operation in the event that the venture underperforms." He looked at her steadily. "That is not an unreasonable condition," he said. "It is actually the central condition," Charlotte said. "Without the water rights as collateral, the original debt instrument has no teeth. I am not proposing a partnership from a position of desperation, Mr. Ashford. I am proposing one from a position of choice. I want to make sure the terms reflect that." There was a pause, during which Charlotte was aware of the surveyor at the far end of the office becoming very interested in a particular section of the map on the wall. Then Phineas Ashford said, "You are right." He said it simply, without qualification or caveat. "Write the condition into the draft and I will sign it." Charlotte had negotiated against lawyers and creditors and cattle buyers in the years of managing the Copper Bell alongside Gerald, and she had learned to read the difference between a man who agreed with you because he was patronizing you and a man who agreed with you because you were correct. Phineas Ashford agreed with her because she was correct. She could hear the difference clearly. She made a note in her own small notebook and looked up. "I will write to Ramon Gutierrez today and have him prepare the formal documents. I would like to have everything reviewed before I sign." "Absolutely," he said. She closed the notebook. There was a natural stopping point in the conversation, the kind of moment where a businesslike woman would thank the man, stand up, and leave to write her letter. Charlotte stayed seated. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He waited. "Gerald described this venture to you in terms of the financial opportunity. He described his wife to you in terms of her capability." She paused. "But you paid for the survey yourself after he died, and you left a letter for me in Gerald's desk without any certainty that I would find it, or read it, or come here. That goes beyond practical interest in a business arrangement." Phineas set down his coffee cup. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet Charlotte noticed that the silver at his temples was more pronounced in the morning light than it had appeared in the afternoon shadows of the saloon. She noticed also that he had a small scar on his left jaw, old and faded, that caught the light at a particular angle. "Gerald was dying when I met him in Santa Fe," Phineas said. He knew it, even if he did not entirely admit it to himself. He was trying to get everything arranged before he ran out of time. He looked at the window, at the pale morning light over the dusty street. "I have seen that kind of urgency before. My father had it at the end. A man running out of time trying to make sure the people he loves will be all right." He paused again. "I could not take the ranch from a woman who had spent years building it, over a debt that was the byproduct of a man trying his best with insufficient time and resources. That is not a complicated reason." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said, "it is not complicated at all." She stood up. He stood too. She held out her hand and he shook it again, and again she noticed the warmth and the steadiness of it, and she did not try not to notice it this time. "I will be in Sweetwater for at least a week," she said, "until I hear back from Ramon Gutierrez and have time to review his assessment." "Mrs. Vega's hotel is comfortable," he said. "The dining room is the best food in town." "She told me," Charlotte said, and something shifted in her face that was very nearly a smile, "that you eat there most evenings." He looked at her with that calm attentiveness that she was beginning to recognize as his particular quality. "I do," he said. "Then I will see you at dinner," she said. She walked out of the land office into the full morning sun of Sweetwater and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, breathing. She was 32 years old. She had buried a husband and faced a debt that could have taken everything she had built, and she was standing on a dusty boardwalk in a small New Mexico town, having just negotiated a business arrangement that would, if the survey numbers held, change the future of the Copper Bell entirely. She was also, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this directly, thinking about the gray-green eyes of Phineas Ashford, and the way he had said "you are right" as though it were the simplest and most natural statement in the world. She walked to the hotel to write her letter to Ramon Gutierrez. The week in Sweetwater extended itself naturally. Charlotte wrote her letter, and then found that there were additional conversations to have with Phineas that were useful for clarifying the terms of the partnership. She visited the high ground section with him on the second day, riding out from town in the early morning when the air was still cool, and she saw for herself the rust-colored outcroppings that Rourke's survey had identified as the primary deposit sites. She was a good rider, despite the side saddle that propriety required, and she noticed Phineas noticing this without comment, which she appreciated. He was good with his horse, a big roan gelding named Calliope for reasons he declined to explain, handling the rough terrain of the high ground without fuss or performance. They walked part of the section on foot, and Phineas showed her where Rourke had taken his core samples, pointing to the marks in the rock face with a knowledge that was genuine and specific. Charlotte asked questions, and he answered them, and occasionally she said something that redirected his explanation toward a different consideration, and he followed the redirection without resistance. On the way back to town, riding through the lower valley in the long light of late morning, Charlotte said, "How long have you been in Sweetwater?" 7 years, he said. "I came from Colorado after the silver market collapsed." "You were in mining before." "I was adjacent to mining," he said. "I ran supply operations. equipment, transportation, food stores for the camps. When the silver market fell, the supply operations fell with it. I came south with what I had saved and bought the saloon as a base of operations and started looking for the next thing. The next thing being land and mineral rights. The next thing being whatever the territory needs that I can provide, he said. Mineral rights have been part of it, water rights as well. I have an interest in the new telegraph line they are routing through the valley next year. Charlotte absorbed this. You are not a simple creditor, she said. No, he agreed. I am not. She looked at the valley below them, the Copper Bell Ranch's southern section visible as a green thread along the creek, standing out against the pale grass and the red earth with the particular vividness of water in a dry country. Her ranch, her creek, her future. Gerald was right, she said, not quite to herself. There is something real here. There has been something real here for a long time, Phineas said quietly. It just needed someone to stay still enough to see it. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley and not at her, and she could not determine whether the remark had a second meaning or whether she was putting one there herself. She decided not to ask. Not yet. That evening at dinner, Mrs. Vega seated them at the same table without making any particular ceremony of it, and they ate and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with the partnership. About Colorado, which Charlotte had passed through on her way west years ago and found extraordinary. About the politics of the territory and the question of statehood, which Phineas had opinions on that were more complicated than she expected. About books, because Charlotte had brought 2 with her from the ranch, and one of them turned out to be a novel Phineas had also read, and they argued pleasantly about its ending for 20 minutes. He walked her back to the hotel door at the end of the evening. On the boardwalk, in the warm dark of the desert night with the stars extraordinarily clear overhead, he said, I am glad you came, Mrs. Wilcox. Gerald told me you would, but I was not certain I believed him. What made you uncertain? She asked. He told me you were stubborn, Phineas said, and there was something in his voice that was very close to warmth. I was not sure whether that meant you would come despite everything or refuse to because he expected it. Charlotte looked at him in the dark. He was not wrong, she said. No, said Phineas. He was not wrong about anything regarding you. She went inside. She lay in bed and looked at the ceiling for a long time, and she thought about the way Gerald had described her to this man, and the way this man had listened, and the way something was happening between her and Phineas Ashford that she had not planned and was not entirely in control of, and which frightened her in a way that was completely different from the fear of losing the ranch. Losing the ranch was a practical fear with practical remedies. This was something else. Ramon Gutierrez's letter arrived on the 5th day. It was thorough as advertised. He had reviewed the survey, the original promissory note, the proposed partnership terms, and the conditions Charlotte had written in regarding the water rights. His assessment was that the survey numbers were credible, the partnership terms were fair with 2 minor amendments he specified, and the water rights condition was both legally sound and, in his professional opinion, entirely appropriate and likely to be accepted without contest by any competent counterpart. He had also added a personal note at the end. He had met Phineas Ashford 3 years ago in connection with a land matter, and while he could not speak to the man's character in personal matters, he could attest that in his professional dealings, Ashford had been consistently straightforward and had never, to Gutierrez's knowledge, attempted to obscure or manipulate the terms of any agreement. Charlotte read this letter twice and then wrote back accepting both of Gutierrez's amendments and asking him to prepare the formal documents. She brought the letter to Phineas at the land office that morning and set it on his desk. He read it carefully. He did not argue with the amendments. He picked up his pen and wrote a note on the copy he was keeping, confirming his agreement with both points, and he signed the note and handed it to Charlotte as confirmation. We have an agreement in principle, he said. We have an agreement in principle, she agreed. He smiled then, the first full smile she had seen on him, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less guarded and somewhat dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with the legal documents on the desk between them. Charlotte's breath did something she did not entirely approve of. "We should celebrate," he said. "Mrs. Vega makes a tres leches cake that is extraordinary. I will ask her to make one for dinner tonight." "That," Charlotte said, "is a perfectly reasonable way to celebrate a business agreement." She walked back to the hotel. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room and looked at herself, at the dust still in the creases of her collar from the morning's ride, at the color in her face from the desert sun, at the expression her face was making that she had not quite put there on purpose. She had been a widow for 4 months. She was a practical woman with a ranch to run and a partnership to finalize, and absolutely no room in her life for complications. She braided her hair differently for dinner. Phineas was already at the table when she came down, and he had brought a bottle of wine that Mrs. Vega was clearly pleased about, and he stood when Charlotte came in, and she sat down, and they had the cake and the wine and 3 more hours of conversation that covered his years in Colorado and her childhood in Missouri, the father who had worked in a law office and the mother who had kept a kitchen garden and insisted on excellent penmanship. They talked about the particular strangeness of the New Mexico territory, which was neither the west of dime novels nor the east of drawing rooms but something entirely its own, ancient and dry and full of a beauty that was difficult to explain to people who had not seen it. Charlotte said, "When I first came here with Gerald, I thought it was the ugliest country I had ever seen. Everything the color of sand. No green except along the water." "What changed?" Phineas asked. "I learned to look differently," she said. "There are things you can only see when the obvious things are stripped away. The light here in the hour before sunset is unlike anything I saw in Missouri. The sky at night. The way the mountains look in January when there is snow on the peaks and the desert floor is still warm enough to go without a coat." She paused. "Gerald said I was describing the place trying to convince myself I loved it, but I was not convincing myself. I actually loved it. I just needed time to find the right way to look at it." Phineas was very quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know exactly what you mean." He was not looking at the window when he said it. He was looking at her. Charlotte picked up her wine glass with the careful deliberateness of a woman who was choosing not to respond to something that had not technically been said. "Tell me," she said, "about the telegraph line project." He told her about the telegraph line and she listened, and neither of them acknowledged what had just happened in the space between them, because it was too new and too uncertain, and they were both, Charlotte understood, people who moved carefully when things mattered. The formal partnership documents arrived from Ramon Gutierrez 10 days after Charlotte had written to him, which was faster than she had expected, and which she suspected reflected his understanding of the time-sensitive nature of the situation. She and Phineas reviewed them together at the land office, going through each clause with the surveyor, Marcus Webb, who served as technical witness, and who had, by this point, become entirely comfortable with Charlotte's presence, and was clearly pleased by the questions she asked. They signed the documents in the land office on a Tuesday morning in early September 1882, with Marcus Webb and Mrs. Vega as witnesses. Mrs. Vega had brought a small bottle of brandy for the occasion, which Charlotte thought was both unnecessary and exactly right. After the signing, Charlotte stood on the boardwalk outside the land office with the sun warming her shoulders and the signed copy of the partnership agreement in her satchel, and she felt the particular sensation of something large being resolved. The debt was gone. The ranch was secure. The future of the Copper Bell was not a question but a project, one with clear terms and reasonable timelines, and a partner who was competent and straightforward, and who looked at her with gray-green eyes that she had stopped trying not to notice. The logical next step was to go home to the ranch. She did not go home immediately. She told herself that it was practical to remain in Sweetwater for a few more days to finalize some of the initial operational planning with Phineas. This was true. There were real things to discuss, but she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that the rational justification had a softer layer underneath it. She was not ready to leave. They rode out to the high ground section again, this time to mark the locations for the initial equipment installation. They walked the creek bank on the Copper Bell's southern edge, and Phineas asked questions about the ranch's water usage patterns that told her he had been thinking about the operational integration carefully and specifically. They had dinner every evening at Mrs. Vega's dining room, and once they ate at a small cantina at the end of the main street, where the food was extraordinary, and the proprietor knew Phineas by name and brought out a second dish without being asked because, he explained, the gentleman always needed more of the red sauce than any reasonable person would admit. Phineas looked faintly embarrassed by this disclosure. Charlotte found it completely endearing and did not say so. On the 12th day of her stay in Sweetwater, she was sitting in the hotel's small common room after dinner with one of her books, and Phineas came in from the street. She had not expected him. He still had his hat on, and there was something in his face that was different from the composed deliberateness she had come to recognize as his habitual expression. He stopped when he saw her. Then he came and sat in the chair across from her, which was what they had started to do in the evenings when they ran out of dinner, and the dining room closed and neither of them was quite ready to say good night. He took his hat off and held it in his hands. "Charlotte," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked up from her book. "I have been trying to determine," he said, "whether what I want to say to you is appropriate, given the circumstances and the timing." "What circumstances?" she said. "You are 4 months a widow," he said. "You came here on a matter of business that directly involved your husband. I would not want you to think that anything I say or do is intended to take advantage of the position you were in, or the grief you are carrying, or the gratitude you might feel about the resolution of the debt." Charlotte set the book down on the side table. She looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at men when she needed them to understand that she was not a delicate situation requiring careful management, but a person with a clear view of her own circumstances. "Phineas," she said, which was also the first time she had used his given name, and she watched him register it the way he registered most things, with that calm attentiveness that was actually a form of great care. "I am a practical woman. I came here to manage a practical problem. I am aware of my own grief, and I am aware of my own position, and I am aware of the difference between gratitude and something else entirely." She paused. "I am also aware that if you are asking me what I think you are asking me, the answer is that I would very much like you to finish asking it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in the beginning of that full smile she had only seen twice before. "I am not a man who speaks well in matters like this," he said. "Then speak badly," she said. "I will understand you anyway." He laughed, a real laugh, quiet and genuine, and the sound of it did something to the room that Charlotte would remember for a very long time. Then he said, "I would like to know you better. I would like to have the time that a proper courtship allows, which I recognize is complicated by the geography of you living in Las Cruces and me living here. I would like to write to you and visit and have you visit, and in doing all of that I would like to determine whether what I feel when you are in the room is what I believe it to be." "What do you believe it to be?" Charlotte asked. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that had the quality of a sky before weather. "Something I have not felt in a long time," he said. "Something I did not expect to feel at all, and certainly not like this, with a woman who walked into my saloon looking like she was prepared to negotiate her way through a wall if necessary." "I was prepared to do exactly that," Charlotte said. "I know," he said. "That is rather the point." She went home to the Copper Bell 2 days later. The morning she left, Phineas was at the stage depot before she arrived, which she had not asked him to be. He helped her with her bags with the same unhurried competence he applied to everything, and he said good-bye with the formality of a man who was aware they were in public, and that she was a widow of 4 months, and that there were things the town of Sweetwater would gossip about regardless, but that he saw no reason to provide additional material. He held her hand for a moment longer than a handshake required. "I will write," he said. "I will write back," she said. She was on the stage for 20 minutes before she allowed herself to smile. The letters started that week. His first letter arrived at the Copper Bell 9 days after Charlotte returned, delivered by the Las Cruces postal rider, who raised his eyebrows very slightly at the Sweetwater postmark and said nothing. Charlotte read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, and it was exactly what she might have expected from Phineas Ashford, which was to say it was precise and thoughtful, and had a dry humor running through it like a seam of silver through rock. He had written about the telegraph line project, about a disagreement with a contractor in Santa Fe that had apparently resolved itself when Phineas had presented the original contract language in the man's own handwriting. He had written about Calliope throwing a shoe on the high ground section, and the resulting detour that had taken him past a stand of cottonwood trees he had not previously noticed. He had written at the end, with the same careful plainness he brought to everything, that he thought about their evenings at Mrs. Vega's dining room quite often and looked forward to the prospect of more of them. Charlotte wrote back that same afternoon. She wrote about the Copper Bell, about the autumn roundup that was beginning and the particular quality of the ranch in October, about a conversation she had with her foreman, a steady man named Samuel Reyes, regarding the changes that the partnership venture would eventually require in terms of water scheduling. She wrote about a hawk she had watched from the porch that morning, which was not particularly useful information, but which she included because she had thought of Phineas when she saw it, and she was not going to be secretive about that. She wrote at the end that she had been thinking about what he had said in the hotel common room, and that she was glad he had said it badly rather than not at all. The letters went back and forth through October and November, growing longer, and on both sides, less careful in the way that meant more careful about different things. Phineas came to Las Cruces in November, and they spent 3 days going over the initial partnership planning documents with Ramon Gutierrez, and walking the Copper Bell's southern section, so that Phineas could see the water management system Samuel Reyes had built over years of careful work. Samuel Reyes watched Phineas Ashford with the evaluative quiet of a man who cared about the ranch's well-being and was forming an opinion. At the end of the second day, when Charlotte asked him what he thought, Samuel said, "He sees what is actually here, not what he wants to see." He paused. "That is not common," Charlotte nodded. "No," she said, "it is not." That evening, in the kitchen of the Copper Bell after dinner, Charlotte and Phineas sat at the same table where she had read the law office letter 4 months earlier, and the contrast between that moment and this one was not lost on her. The lamp was low, and the night outside the window was full of desert stars and the particular silence of a working ranch after the day's labor was done. Phineas said, "I have been thinking about geography." "The geography problem," Charlotte said. "You cannot run this ranch from Sweetwater," he said, "and the venture's operational center will need to be here, because the site is here and the water access is here. I have been considering whether the saloon and the land office work I do in Sweetwater requires my permanent presence there, or whether those can be managed with periodic visits." Charlotte looked at her coffee cup. "That is a significant rearrangement," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I am not proposing anything specific tonight. I am telling you the direction my thinking is going, because you have the right to know what I am considering before I have finished considering it." She looked at him. Outside, a coyote called somewhere in the dark hills, and the lamp made a small, steady light against the desert night, and she thought about the 4 words at the bottom of that letter. "Come and find me." She had found him. He had apparently decided, in the careful, unhurried way of a man who did his arithmetic before he made a decision, that he was willing to relocate the question. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "I want you to know," he said, "that my thinking about the geography is separate from my thinking about the partnership, The business arrangement stands regardless. I would not want you to feel that one is contingent on the other." "I know," she said, "but I also know that they are related for you, because you are not a man who does things for only one reason." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, I suppose I am not." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the first time she had initiated contact between them, and she felt him go very still in the way of a man who is doing his best not to make the moment smaller by overreacting to it. "Stay for Christmas," she said. "If you can manage the saloon and the land office, come back and stay through the holiday." He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it. "I can manage it," he said. He stayed through Christmas and past New Year's of 1883, and during that time the Copper Bell became a different place. Not noisier or more complicated, but fuller somehow, as though a window had been opened that Charlotte had not realized was closed. Phineas had a capacity for useful work that was both practical and companionable. He helped Samuel Rays with the winter water line repairs without being asked, and without making it a gesture. He fixed the broken hinge on the barn door on a cold January morning, because the door was broken, and he happened to have the tools and the skill and the time. He read in the evenings while Charlotte worked on the ranch accounts, and they talked across the lamplight with the easy accumulating intimacy of people who have discovered that they like the same quality of silence. In February, a problem arrived that tested the partnership in a direct way. A man named Doyle Cutter, who held a grazing lease on land adjacent to the high ground section, presented a legal claim that the Copper Ventures' planned road access would cross his lease boundary in a way that interfered with his cattle routes. The claim was made through a lawyer in Santa Fe and was technically complex enough that it required Charlotte and Phineas both to spend 3 days reviewing documents with Ramon Gutierrez. Doyle Cutter was not a villain in the simple sense. He was a man with a legitimate concern about access to his leased land, and a lawyer who had filed the claim in the most aggressive available format, because that was how the lawyer practiced. Charlotte found this out after an afternoon conversation with Cutter himself at his lease boundary, which she had ridden to alone while Phineas was in Las Cruces with Gutierrez. Cutter was a weathered man in his 50s who had been ranching the New Mexico territory for 20 years. He told Charlotte plainly that his concern was the specific route of the access road, not the venture itself, and that if the road were routed 200 yards to the east, which would require crossing a small ridge, it would clear his cattle routes entirely and he would withdraw the claim. Charlotte looked at the terrain and pulled out the map she had brought and asked Cutter to show her the exact section he was concerned about. He showed her. She asked 2 questions about his cattle's seasonal movement patterns. Then she told him she would speak with her partner and get back to him within a week. She came back to the ranch and wrote to Phineas at the land office and described the conversation and the proposed solution. He wired back from Las Cruces the next morning. The eastern route was feasible. It added approximately 3 weeks to the road construction timeline and a modest additional cost. Accept the terms and withdraw the claim. Charlotte wrote to Cutter that same day. The claim was withdrawn within 2 weeks. The access road was rerouted. The problem was resolved without litigation and without antagonism, and Doyle Cutter became, in subsequent months, a reliable source of local knowledge about the terrain that proved genuinely useful. Phineas, when he heard Charlotte's account of the conversation with Cutter, said, "You went to see him alone." "It seemed like the faster approach," Charlotte said. "It was," he said. "I am not objecting. I am noting it because the instinct to go directly to the source and find out what the actual problem is, rather than fighting the legal claim at face value, is precisely the instinct that is going to make this venture work." "Gerald always fought legal claims at face value," Charlotte said. "I know," Phineas said, and there was no criticism in it, only the acknowledgement of a fact they both held. Spring arrived with the velocity that the desert springs always have, moving from cold brown stillness to warm green abundance in a matter of weeks. The first equipment orders were placed in March, with the machinery consignment expected to arrive in El Paso by late summer. Marcus Webb began the initial site preparation on the high ground section in April, and Charlotte rode up to check the progress every week. Phineas had formally arranged the sale of his majority stake in the Sweetwater Saloon to his business manager in March, retaining a small interest that he could manage by correspondence and occasional visits. He kept the land office work in Sweetwater, but transferred most of the operational aspects to a trusted associate, a young man named Vicent Flores who had worked for him for 3 years and was, Phineas said, more organized than any person had a right to be. He was at the Copper Bell more than he was not by April. They had not discussed this formally. It had simply happened, the way the water in the creek finds its level without being directed. One evening in late April, Charlotte was on the porch watching the sunset, which was one of those New Mexico sunsets that justified everything difficult about living there, all pink and orange and purple over the mountains, and Phineas came and stood beside her, and they watched it together in silence until it was done. Then he said, "I would like to ask you something that I have been thinking about for some time." She did not look at him. She kept looking at where the sunset had been, at the deep blue beginning to take its place. "Then ask it," she said. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the ranch or the venture or the geography problem, all of which we have managed without requiring the question to be asked, but because I am in love with you, which I have been for longer than I have been willing to say directly, and because I would like the rest of my life to contain you in it, permanently and specifically as my wife." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. The stars were beginning to appear, one at a time in the deepening blue. "I am in love with you also," she said. "I have been managing that fact for approximately 6 months. "I know," he said. "I was managing it too." She looked at him then. He was looking at her with the gray-green eyes and the full attention, and the quality of being entirely unhurried even while waiting for an answer that mattered enormously. "Yes," she said. "I would like to marry you." He kissed her for the first time, there on the porch with the desert stars coming out and the last light fading from the mountains, and it was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had waited long enough and had no intention of being unclear about what he meant. Charlotte thought briefly and warmly about the 4 words at the bottom of the letter. Come and find me. She had found him. She was, she thought, going to keep him. They were married in June of 1883. In the small Catholic church in Las Cruces, because Mrs. Vega had made clear that any wedding not performed in a church and attended by the appropriate community would be a personal disappointment she would not soon recover from, and because Samuel Reyes and his wife Maria had been preparing for weeks to host the celebration afterward at the Copper Bell, and it seemed unnecessary to disappoint either of them. Ramon Gutierrez stood as a witness. Vicent Flores came down from Sweetwater with 3 other members of the town, who had apparently adopted Charlotte as an honorary citizen during her original week-long stay. The celebration at the ranch went on until midnight and involved a great deal of Mrs. Vega's cooking and Maria Reyes's tamales, which were spoken of by every person present as the finest food they had ever consumed, and a fiddle and guitar played by 2 of Samuel's hands who turned out to have been playing together at ranch celebrations for 15 years. Charlotte danced with Phineas under the stars on the flat ground beside the barn, which had been swept and hung with paper lanterns. Mrs. Vega had brought from Las Cruces in her wagon, and she was aware of the extraordinary particular feeling of being completely, correctly, specifically in the right place with the right person, which was a feeling she had not been certain she would ever have. She thought of Gerald briefly and with complicated warmth. He had made a mess of things, as always. He had also, as always, had a fundamental instinct toward the right outcome that had managed, despite everything, to point in the correct direction. He had borrowed money from the right man. He had told that man the truth about his wife. He had left a letter in a desk drawer where she would find it. She thought that was probably the best thing Charlotte Wilcox had ever done for her. The stamp mill equipment arrived in El Paso in August, delayed by 2 weeks from the original estimate but in good condition. The transport from El Paso to the site was a considerable logistical operation that Marcus Webb managed with the methodical efficiency he brought to everything. And Phineas spent 2 weeks in the field overseeing the installation with a hands-on engagement that Charlotte recognized as the supply operations background from Colorado, the knowledge of how machinery moved and where it was likely to go wrong. She came to the site on the 3rd week, and she walked through the installation with Phineas and Marcus, and the 2 specialists who had come from El Paso to oversee the technical setup. And she asked questions that Marcus answered with the particular satisfaction of an expert being asked by someone who actually understood the answers. At the end of the walkthrough, standing on the rocky high ground with the valley spread below, and the Copper Bells Creek visible as a green line in the distance, and the stamp mill taking shape behind them, Charlotte turned to Phineas and said, "We are really doing this." "We have been doing this for over a year," he said. "Doing the paperwork and riding the terrain is not the same as watching the machinery go up," she said. He looked at the installation and she watched him look at it, and she saw in his face the same thing she felt herself. The particular satisfaction of a thing that has been planned carefully actually becoming real in the world. "No," he agreed. "It is not the same." She took his hand, which was covered in dust from the site, and he held it, and they stood on the high ground together and watched Marcus direct the positioning of the mill housing with the same comfortable ease they had developed for standing together and watching things. The first test extraction was run in November of 1883, 15 months after Charlotte had signed the partnership documents in Sweetwater's land office. The results were within range of Rourke's conservative estimates, which, given Phineas's assessment that Rourke tended to be conservative, was a reasonable beginning. The decision was made to expand the extraction operation in the spring, pending the results of the first 3 months' yield data. By this point, the Copper Bell Ranch was running as 2 parallel operations. The cattle and water-based ranch work that Samuel Reyes managed with his usual quiet competence, and the copper venture that Charlotte and Phineas oversaw together, making joint decisions on the operational questions, and dividing the managerial responsibilities along the lines of their respective strengths. Phineas had a grasp of the supply chain and the equipment logistics that Charlotte was content to rely on. Charlotte had an understanding of the water system and the land relationships with neighboring properties that Phineas increasingly deferred to. They argued sometimes in the way of 2 competent people who have slightly different approaches to the same problem, but the arguments were productive. They had both, apparently, learned to say you are right when the other person was right, and this turned out to be the most important skill in a working partnership. In December, Charlotte realized she was pregnant. She told Phineas on a Sunday evening after dinner when they were sitting in the parlor that they had refurnished in the summer, a room that now had books on the shelves and a good reading lamp, and a wool rug that Mrs. Vega had sent down from Albuquerque, where she had cousins who sold such things. He was reading and she was adding figures in the ranch account book, and she set the pen down and said, "I have something to tell you." He set his book down and looked at her with that full attention. She told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then his face did something she had not seen before, which was to entirely abandon its composure in favor of an expression that was purely, unambiguously, a kind of joy she found impossible to look at without feeling it herself. "Charlotte," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you all right?" "I am entirely all right," she said. "I am very well, in fact, but you should know." He came and sat beside her on the settee and took both of her hands in both of his, and he held them carefully and looked at her with the gray-green eyes that had the quality of a sky after weather, the particular clarity that comes when the storm has passed and everything is washed clean. "I did not know," he said quietly, "that I wanted this until this moment." "I suspected you might," she said. "Did you?" "You looked at Maria Reyes's youngest for about 10 minutes at the harvest supper last month," Charlotte said, with a face that told a complete story. He laughed. "I did not realize I was being observed." "I observe most things," she said. "I know," he said, and kissed her, and she leaned into him in the lamplight with the desert night outside the window and the ranch quiet around them, and she thought that the world had rearranged itself considerably in the past year and a half, and all of the rearrangement had been correct. Their son was born in August of 1884, a healthy boy who arrived in the world with a strong opinion about it and a set of lungs that impressed the midwife and alarmed the horses in the nearby barn. They named him Thomas Gerald Ashford, Thomas for the surveyor whose completed work had made everything possible, Gerald for the man whose chaotic, well-meaning heart had started the whole thing in motion. Samuel Reyes held the baby on the afternoon of the second day and said, very seriously, "He looks like he knows what he wants." Charlotte said that was exactly right. Phineas held his son with the careful steadiness he brought to everything that mattered, and he looked at Thomas Gerald Ashford with the expression Charlotte had first glimpsed at the harvest supper, the one that had told a complete story, and she saw now that the story had reached its proper conclusion. The copper venture's second year of operation outperformed the first. Rourke's conservative estimates proved, as Phineas had suspected, to be genuinely conservative, and the spring expansion of the extraction operation brought the monthly yields to a level that made Ramon Gutierrez, reviewing the quarterly figures, say words that Charlotte suspected he had not used since he was a much younger man practicing law in much less genteel surroundings. By 1885, the venture was producing a consistent return that had effectively retired the original $12,000 note several times over in terms of value generated, which Charlotte tracked in the account books with the same precision she applied to the ranch finances. Phineas occasionally looked at the figures and then at her and said, "Gerald was right about the copper." And Charlotte always said, "Gerald was right about a great many things. He was just right about them in the wrong order." Vicent Flores came down from Sweetwater with good news in March of 1885, which was that the telegraph line through the valley that Phineas had invested in was performing well, and that a second line was being proposed along the southern route that would bring Sweetwater into even closer communication with El Paso. Vicent had managed the Sweetwater operation with remarkable competence, and had additionally, he mentioned with a certain careful casualness, become engaged to a young schoolteacher named Anita Delgado who taught at the yellow schoolhouse on the main street. Charlotte organized a celebration. Phineas looked at Vicent with the particular expression of a man who felt responsible for someone's happiness in an indirect but real way, and was glad to see it arrived at. Thomas Gerald was 10 months old during Vicent's visit, and had recently mastered the skill of pulling himself upright against the furniture, which he demonstrated to Vicent with tremendous personal satisfaction. Vicent said he was very impressive. Thomas made a sound that suggested he agreed. Life on the Copper Bell in 1885 had the quality of something that had been built carefully from good materials. The ranch cattle operation was profitable and stable under Samuel Reyes's management. The copper venture was producing at its expanded capacity and showing no signs of geological difficulty in the near-term deposit sites. The partnership documents, now supplemented by 3 amendments reflecting the operational expansion, were in Ramon Gutierrez's files, clean and complete. Charlotte managed the combined financial accounts for both operations and continued to be the person who rode to Doyle Cutter's boundary to talk through any terrain access questions, which came up twice a year with reasonable predictability. Cutter had become, over time, the kind of neighbor who sent word when he saw something on the range that looked relevant to the Copper Bell's interests, and Charlotte sent him a bottle of good whiskey at Christmas, which he acknowledged with a handwritten note that was very brief and entirely genuine. In the spring of 1886, Charlotte discovered she was pregnant again. She told Phineas on a Thursday morning before he rode up to the high ground site, and he stopped with his hat in his hand and looked at her with the joy that was the same as it had been the first time, fully present and unambiguous. Thomas needs a sibling, he said. Thomas, Charlotte said, needs someone who will eventually argue with him. He is developing very strong opinions and no opposition. Phineas laughed. He got that from somewhere. He absolutely got that from you, Charlotte said. She was not wrong. Thomas Gerald Ashford, at 20 months, had a will that expressed itself in the direct, composed, utterly unhurried manner of his father, which was somehow more persuasive than noise would have been, and which had Mrs. Vega, on her most recent visit, declaring him the most remarkable child she had encountered in 40 years of acquaintance with children. The second child was a daughter, born in October of 1886, and they named her Elena Rourke Ashford, Elena for Mrs. Vega, who had made the tres leches cake at the beginning, and the paper lanterns at the wedding, and who wept when she heard the name, and Rourke for Thomas Rourke the surveyor. In the long tradition they had apparently established of naming their children for the people who had moved the story forward. Thomas Gerald, now 2 years old, regarded his sister with the careful attention of a scientist encountering a new phenomenon, and declared, after approximately 4 days of observation, that she was all right. Maria Reyes said this was the highest praise she had heard from a 2-year-old. The copper venture ran for 9 productive years from its operational start, which was above Rourke's estimate of 8 to 12 and close to the upper bound of the range, and which generated sufficient yield to retire all of the original venture costs, fund 3 operational expansions, pay Ramon Gutierrez's considerable legal fees over the period, support a scholarship fund that Phineas quietly established for the Las Cruces School, and accumulate a reserve sufficient to maintain the Copper Bell independently of any outside revenue source for the foreseeable future. When the primary deposit site showed signs of approaching exhaustion in 1892, Charlotte and Phineas made the decision to scale back the extraction operation over 18 months rather than push the site to diminishing returns, which Marcus Webb, now a full partner in the operational management, said was the most sensible exit strategy he had seen in 20 years of site work. The machinery was sold in 1894 to a new operation in Arizona at a price that reflected its maintained condition, and the high ground section, cleared of its industrial purpose, became what the survey had described and what Gerald had imagined, a piece of terrain with interesting geology and excellent views, returned to the desert's own use. The Copper Bell Ranch, in 1895, was entirely what Charlotte had intended to keep when she boarded the stage in Las Cruces 13 years earlier with her husband's letters, and a promissory note, and 4 words written in a careful hand at the bottom of a letter that had been waiting for her in a desk drawer. Thomas Gerald Ashford was 11 years old, and studying everything he could find in the ranch's now considerable library, with the focused appetite of a boy who had inherited his father's arithmetic mind, and his mother's instinct for the actual question, beneath the apparent one. Elena Rourke Ashford was 9, and had her father's gray-green eyes, and her mother's particular quality of noticing things without commenting on them immediately, a skill that her teacher at the Las Cruces School described as unusual in a child her age. Phineas came in from the range one afternoon in late October, the same kind of afternoon light that had been falling over Sweetwater when Charlotte first walked into the saloon, that particular gold the New Mexico desert produced in autumn that was unlike any other light anywhere. He came onto the porch where Charlotte was sitting with the account books, which were a matter of routine maintenance now rather than urgent crisis management, and he sat in the other chair and looked at the mountains with the view she had described to him once as something you could only see when the obvious things were stripped away. Vicent's second child arrived, he said. Anita sent a letter. A boy. Charlotte asked. A girl, he said. They named her something very long that I will tell you when I can pronounce it correctly. Charlotte smiled. Send them something good from the Gutierrez shop. Anita will know what we mean. He looked at the mountains for a while. The light was doing what it did in October, making the peaks look as though they were lit from within. Charlotte, he said, "Yes," she said in the tone that indicated she was listening completely. "I have been thinking about the fact," he said, "that I have been happier in this house, on this land with you and our children, than I have been anywhere or at any other time in my life. I have been thinking about it because it seems like the kind of thing that ought to be said plainly rather than assumed." She set the account book down and looked at him. He was 46 years old, the silver more pronounced at his temples now, the weathering deeper, the composed steadiness of his face more thoroughly settled than it had been when she first saw him across a table in a Sweetwater saloon. He was, she thought, in the way she sometimes looked at him when she thought she was not being observed, extraordinarily beautiful to her in the way that things are beautiful when you understand them all the way through. "I have been happier here than anywhere," she said, "with you." "That is also true." He reached over and took her hand in the way he had on the high ground the day the machinery went up, simply and completely. They sat on the porch in the October light and looked at the mountains. Inside, Thomas Gerald could be heard having a vigorous argument with someone about something, and Alina could be heard providing a counter-argument in the precise, patient voice that meant she had already thought of 3 points and was deploying them in order. This was a familiar sound. It was, Charlotte thought, one of her favorite sounds in the world. "We did something real here," Phineas said. "We did," Charlotte said. She thought about all of it. The letter in the desk drawer, the stage to Las Cruces, the walk into the Sweetwater saloon on a September afternoon in 1882 with a dead husband's debt and a leather satchel and a will that Gerald had correctly described as stubborn. The man who had been doing his accounts at a corner table and had looked up and said her name as though he had been expecting her. The 4 words, "Come and find me." She had found him. She had found more than she had come looking for, more than the resolved debt, and the secured ranch, and the venture that had paid off exactly as the careful arithmetic had suggested it would. She had found the person with whom the future was not a thing to be managed and survived, but a thing to be built deliberately and specifically from good materials. "I owe Gerald one apology," she said. "What apology?" Phineas asked. "I spent years thinking his optimism was the main problem," she said. "It turned out to be the main solution. He just needed someone to finish the arithmetic." Phineas was quiet for a moment. Then, "You finished it." "We finished it," Charlotte said. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The mountains held their light, and the desert held its silence, and the porch of the Copper Bell Ranch held the two of them, as it had on many evenings before and would on many evenings to come, in the extraordinary ordinary fact of 2 people who had found each other in the middle of unfinished business and had made something complete. Inside, Thomas Gerald's argument had apparently reached a resolution, because Alina said, in her patient carrying voice, "I told you so," and Thomas made a sound that was the grudging but genuine acknowledgement of someone who has been correctly opposed. Phineas turned to Charlotte with the full smile, the one that had changed his face entirely the first time she saw it and had never stopped doing so. "She is going to be formidable," he said. "She already is," Charlotte said. And the evening came on, and the stars arrived one by one in the deep blue sky over the New Mexico desert, and the lamp was lit in the parlor window, and the Copper Bell Ranch sat in the quiet good dark of a life that had been built from something that could have broken entirely and had instead been made whole.